I should have trusted my instincts when he suggested the restaurant. Something about the way Lucas had insisted on this particular place, the subtle authority in his voice when he'd made the reservation, should have set off warning bells. But after 3 months of drowning in textbooks and the lingering ache of my ex-boyfriend's betrayal, the promise of an expensive dinner with a mysterious stranger had felt like exactly the escape I needed. The Golden Vine sat nestled in the heart of downtown's financial district, its understated elegance speaking of old money and older secrets. Crystal chandeliers cast warm amber light across cream-colored walls adorned with original oil paintings, while the soft murmur of conversation mingled with the gentle clink of silverware against fine china. The air itself seemed to shimmer with wealth, carrying the subtle scents of truffle oil, aged wine, and something else I couldn't quite identify. A masculine cologne that made my pulse quicken, despite my attempts to remain composed. I smoothed my black dress nervously, the fabric feeling suddenly too tight, too revealing under the restaurant's intimate lighting. The hostess had led me to a private alcove in the back, separated from the main dining room by heavy burgundy curtains that muffled sound and created a cocoon of intimacy I hadn't expected. The table was set for 2 with precision that spoke of military discipline, each piece of silverware aligned perfectly, the wine glasses polished to a mirror shine, the white tablecloth so pristine it seemed to glow in the candlelight. My phone buzzed against my clutch, probably another text from my roommate asking for details about my mysterious date. I'd met Lucas on a dating app 3 days ago, his profile picture showing just enough of a strong jawline and piercing dark eyes to intrigue me without revealing too much. Our conversation had been brief, but captivating. He'd asked the right questions, shown genuine interest in my literature studies, and when he'd suggested dinner at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, I'd said yes before my practical side could object. The soft sound of approaching footsteps made me look up, and my breath caught in my throat. The man walking toward me bore little resemblance to the casual photos I'd seen on his phone. This version of Lucas Moretti was devastating in his perfection, tall and broad-shouldered in a charcoal suit that had clearly been tailored to emphasize every line of his powerful frame. His dark hair was swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and commanding presence. But it was his eyes that held me captive, storm-gray depths that seemed to see straight through me, cataloging every thought, every reaction, every involuntary flutter of attraction. "Lily," he said, my name rolling off his tongue like a caress. His voice was deeper than I remembered from our brief phone call, carrying a slight accent I couldn't quite place. Italian, perhaps, or something Mediterranean that made every word sound like poetry. "Lucas," I managed, accepting his offered hand as he helped me to my feet. His touch sent electricity shooting up my arm, the warmth of his palm against mine making me acutely aware of how cold I'd been before he arrived. "You look different than your photos." A smile curved his lips, not quite reaching those penetrating eyes. "Photography rarely captures the full truth, don't you think? Please sit." He moved around the table with fluid grace, pulling out my chair with old-world courtesy that should have seemed antiquated, but instead felt like a glimpse into a more refined way of life. As he settled across from me, I noticed how he positioned himself with his back to the wall, his gaze constantly scanning our surroundings. The behavior struck me as odd, hyper-vigilant in a way that suggested either paranoia or the kind of wariness that came from real danger. "This place is incredible," I said, gesturing toward the opulent surroundings as a server appeared, seemingly from nowhere to pour wine from a bottle I was certain cost more than my monthly rent. "I've never eaten anywhere this fancy before." "I thought you might enjoy it," Lucas replied, his attention focused entirely on me, despite the bustling activity of the restaurant around us. "A beautiful woman deserves beautiful things." Heat crept up my neck at the compliment, delivered with such casual confidence that it felt like a statement of fact rather than flattery. I took a sip of wine to steady myself, the rich burgundy coating my tongue with flavors so complex I could have spent an hour analyzing them. Everything about this evening felt surreal, as if I'd stepped through a doorway into a world that existed parallel to my own. One where mysterious men took college students to restaurants that probably had months-long waiting lists, where every detail was orchestrated with precision that bordered on the supernatural. "So," I said, attempting to regain some equilibrium, "tell me what you do. Your profile was pretty vague about work." Something shifted in his expression, a shadow passing across those gray eyes before the polite mask slipped back into place. "Import and export. Nothing too exciting, I'm afraid. International business can be quite dull." The answer felt rehearsed, too smooth and generic to be completely truthful. I studied his face, noting the expensive watch on his wrist, the quality of his clothing, the way the staff seemed to defer to him without him saying a word. Whatever Lucas Moretti did for a living, it clearly paid well enough to afford this kind of lifestyle. "What about you?" he continued before I could probe further. "Literature major, you mentioned. What draws you to studying stories?" The question seemed genuine, his interest sharp and focused in a way that made me feel like the only person in the room. "I suppose I'm fascinated by the way words can create entire worlds," I said, surprised by how easily the truth spilled out. "The power of narrative to shape reality, to make people feel things they've never experienced. There's something almost magical about the right combination of words." "Magical," he repeated thoughtfully, his gaze never leaving my face. "Yes, I can see how that would appeal to you. You have the look of someone who believes in magic." Before I could ask what he meant by that, our server returned with the first course. Something delicate and artfully arranged that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce. The interruption gave me a moment to study Lucas more carefully, and what I saw made my pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with attraction. He carried himself like a man accustomed to command, every gesture precise and controlled. When he spoke to the server, his tone was polite, but carried an underlying authority that suggested he was used to being obeyed without question. The way other diners occasionally glanced our way, their expressions mixing curiosity with what looked suspiciously like deference, hinted at a level of recognition that went beyond mere wealth. "Are you enjoying your meal?" he asked, cutting into his own dish with surgical precision. "It's incredible," I admitted, savoring flavors I couldn't begin to identify. "Though I have to ask, how did you get a reservation here on such short notice? I looked this place up online, and everything I read suggested they're booked months in advance." That shadow passed across his features again, and for a moment, his carefully composed mask slipped just enough to reveal something darker underneath. "I have connections," he said simply. "When you know the right people, certain doors open." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. There was something in his tone that suggested those connections came with a price, that the doors he referenced might lead to places most people wouldn't want to go. But before I could analyze the feeling further, he was asking about my classes, my goals, my dreams, with such focused attention that I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected. As the evening progressed through course after exquisite course, I began to relax, despite the nagging sense that I was missing something important. Lucas was charming, intelligent, and showed genuine interest in everything I said. He told stories about his travels that painted vivid pictures of exotic locations, spoke knowledgeably about literature and art, and demonstrated a quick wit that kept me laughing despite my initial nervousness. But underneath the surface charm, I sensed something else. A carefully controlled intensity that reminded me of a predator playing with its prey. The way his eyes tracked my every movement, how he seemed to catalog each expression, each gesture, as if he was studying me for some purpose I couldn't fathom. When I excused myself to the restroom, I caught him watching me walk away with an expression that made my breath catch. Not just desire, but something far more possessive, as if he was already calculating how to keep me from leaving. The bathroom was as opulent as the rest of the restaurant, all marble and gold fixtures that belonged in a palace rather than a dining establishment. I stared at my reflection in the ornate mirror, noting the flush in my cheeks, the brightness in my eyes that spoke of attraction I wasn't entirely comfortable feeling. Something about Lucas pulled at me in ways I didn't understand, made me want to lean closer despite every instinct warning me to be careful. When I returned to the table, I found him in quiet conversation with a man I hadn't seen before. Someone whose expensive suit couldn't quite disguise the hardness in his features or the way his eyes constantly scanned the room like a bodyguard's. They spoke in rapid Italian, their voices too low for me to catch individual words, but the tone suggested business rather than pleasure. The stranger melted away as I approached, disappearing so smoothly I might have imagined him if not for the slight tension that lingered in Lucas's shoulders. "Everything all right?" I asked, settling back into my chair. "Of course," he replied, but his smile seemed forced now, and I noticed how his hands remained perfectly still on the white tablecloth, as if he was exercising conscious control over every gesture. "Just a minor business matter. Nothing that should concern you." The phrase sent another chill through me, though I couldn't articulate why. The way he said, "concern you," suggested that there were many things in his world that I shouldn't worry about, that he was accustomed to compartmentalizing his life in ways that kept certain truths hidden from view. As we shared dessert, a chocolate creation that was more art than food, Lucas leaned back in his chair and studied me with renewed intensity. "I find myself curious about something, Lily," he said, his voice taking on a lower, more intimate tone. "What made you say yes to dinner with a stranger? You strike me as someone who's typically more cautious." The question caught me off guard with its perceptiveness. Honestly, I'm not sure. Maybe I was tired of being cautious. My last relationship ended badly, and I suppose I wanted to do something spontaneous for once. "Ah," he said, something predatory flickering in his eyes. "A broken heart, then. Someone hurt you." It wasn't a question, and the certainty in his voice made me uncomfortable. "It's not really something I want to discuss on a first date," I said, attempting to keep my tone light. "Of course not," he agreed smoothly. "But I find myself protective of you already, cara mia. The thought of someone causing you pain." He let the sentence hang unfinished, but something dark and dangerous crept into his expression that made my pulse race for entirely different reasons. The endearment, delivered in what was definitely Italian, sent warmth pooling in my stomach despite the warning bells going off in my head. There was something deeply unsettling about the casual possessiveness in his tone, as if he had already decided I belonged to him based on a single evening together. "Lucas," I began, not sure what I wanted to say but feeling the need to establish some boundaries. "Tell me," he interrupted gently, "what are your plans for the rest of the evening? It's still early, and I find myself reluctant to let this night end." The way he phrased it, not asking what I wanted to do, but what my existing plans were, as if he intended to rearrange them regardless of my answer, sent another flutter of unease through me. But when he reached across the table to cover my hand with his, the warmth of his touch scattered my concerns like smoke. "I should probably head home," I said, though the words felt hollow even to my own ears. "I have classes tomorrow." "Of course," he agreed, but his thumb traced small circles on the back of my hand that made it difficult to concentrate on anything else. "Allow me to drive you. It's the least I can do after such a lovely evening." Something in his tone suggested this wasn't really a request, though he phrased it politely enough. And despite every rational thought screaming that I should call a cab, should maintain my independence, should not get into a car with a man I'd known for exactly 3 hours, I found myself nodding. The car waiting outside the restaurant wasn't what I'd expected. Where I'd imagined something sleek and expensive but relatively normal, Lucas led me instead to a black Mercedes S-Class that practically screamed wealth and power. The vehicle's windows were tinted so dark they seemed to absorb light, and as we approached, a man in a crisp black suit emerged from the driver's seat to open the rear door. He nodded respectfully to Lucas, his eyes briefly meeting mine with professional courtesy, before returning to scan the street with the same hyper-vigilant awareness I'd noticed in Lucas. "This is Marco," Lucas said as he helped me into the plush leather interior. "He's been with me for several years." Marco inclined his head slightly. "Miss," he said in accented English, his voice carrying the same subtle Mediterranean inflection as Lucas's. There was something about the way he held himself, the slight bulge beneath his jacket, that made me think his role extended beyond simple driving duties. The interior of the car was a study in understated luxury, soft leather seats that seemed to mold themselves to my body, ambient lighting that cast everything in a warm golden glow, and technology integrated so seamlessly it appeared almost magical. Lucas settled beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell that intoxicating cologne that seemed to wrap around my senses like silk. "Where shall I tell Marco to take you?" Lucas asked, his voice low and intimate in the enclosed space. I rattled off my address in the University District, hyper-aware of how shabby my little apartment building must sound compared to the obvious wealth surrounding me. If Lucas found the location surprising or disappointing, he gave no indication, simply relaying the information to Marco in rapid Italian before raising the privacy partition between us and the driver. Suddenly, we were alone in our own private world, the city lights streaming past the tinted windows like falling stars. The silence stretched between us, comfortable yet charged with an undercurrent of tension I couldn't quite identify. Lucas's presence seemed to fill the space, making me acutely aware of every breath, every heartbeat, every tiny shift in the leather seats. "Thank you for tonight," I said, attempting to break the spell his proximity seemed to cast. "Dinner was incredible. I feel like I've stepped into someone else's life for a few hours." His smile in the dim light was enigmatic, almost predatory. "Perhaps you have. Tell me, Lily, do you ever feel constrained by the boundaries of your current existence, limited by the expectations others have placed upon you?" The question was oddly philosophical for casual conversation, and something in his tone suggested layers of meaning I wasn't grasping. "I suppose everyone feels that way sometimes," I replied carefully. "Why do you ask?" Instead of answering directly, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a small black box that made my breath catch in my throat. "I have something for you," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate gold necklace with a pendant that caught the ambient light and threw it back in brilliant sparkles. The piece was clearly expensive, probably worth more than my car, and utterly inappropriate for someone I'd known for less than 4 hours. "Lucas, I can't accept this," I protested, even as my eyes were drawn to the way the pendant seemed to capture and hold light like a tiny star. "It's beautiful, but we barely know each other." "Beauty should be adorned with beauty," he replied, lifting the necklace from its velvet nest. "And I find myself wanting to see how it looks against your skin." Before I could protest further, he was moving closer, his hands gentle but insistent as he fastened the chain around my neck. His fingers brushed against my nape, sending shivers down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool metal settling against my throat. The pendant rested just above my collarbone, its weight a constant reminder of his touch, his claim. "Perfect," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear, though I suspected it would be. The way he said it suggested he'd chosen the piece specifically for me, which was impossible given that we'd met only days ago through a dating app. Unless. The thought that he might have been planning this evening, this moment, with far more calculation than I'd realized sent a chill through me that warred with the heat of his proximity. "How did you know my style?" I asked, touching the pendant nervously. "This is exactly the kind of thing I would choose for myself." His smile was enigmatic. "I'm observant by nature. It served me well in business." There was something about the way he said business that made it sound like a euphemism. But before I could analyze the feeling further, the car was slowing to a stop outside my building. Through the tinted windows, I could see the familiar sight of my modest apartment complex. 3 stories of aging brick and narrow windows that suddenly looked even more shabby in contrast to the luxury surrounding me. Marco was already out of the car, opening my door with the same professional efficiency he'd displayed at the restaurant. But as I moved to exit, Lucas caught my wrist, his fingers circling the delicate bones with surprising strength. "Lily," he said, his voice carrying a note of command that made me freeze. "I want to see you again, tomorrow night." It wasn't phrased as a question or even a request, but rather as a statement of fact, as if my agreement was already assumed. The presumption should have annoyed me, should have triggered my independent streak that had gotten me through 3 years of college mostly on my own. Instead, I found myself drowning in those storm-gray eyes, unable to form the refusal I knew I should give. "I have studying to do," I managed weakly, though the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. "After," he said simply. "I'll pick you up at 8. Before I could respond, he was pressing something into my palm, a business card made of heavy stock paper that felt expensive between my fingers. In the ambient lighting, I could just make out an address in the city's most exclusive district and a phone number printed in elegant script. "If you need anything before then," he said, his thumb stroking across my pulse point in a gesture that seemed both tender and possessive. "Call me. Day or night, Lily. I want you to know that you're under my protection now." The phrasing struck me as odd. Who talked about protection on a first date? But the intensity in his voice, the way his gray eyes seemed to burn into mine, scattered my ability to think clearly. I nodded mutely, clutching the card as he finally released my wrist. "Good girl," he murmured, the words sending an unexpected jolt of heat through me. "Sleep well, cara mia. Dream of me." I stumbled out of the car on unsteady legs, clutching my purse and the business card as Marco shut the door behind me with a soft thud. The Mercedes pulled away into the night, its taillights disappearing around a corner like red eyes winking out of existence. Only then did I realize I was standing on the sidewalk touching the pendant at my throat, my skin still tingling where his fingers had traced my pulse. The walk up 3 flights of stairs to my apartment felt surreal, as if I was returning to someone else's life after a brief sojourn in a fairy tale. My key stuck in the lock as it always did, requiring the familiar jiggle and curse that seemed absurdly mundane after the evening's elegance. Inside, my small studio apartment looked even more cramped and shabby than usual, the secondhand furniture I'd been proud to afford now seeming pathetic in comparison to the luxury I'd just experienced. I caught sight of myself in the mirror above my dresser and paused, hardly recognizing the woman staring back at me. The pendant gleamed against my throat like a brand, and my cheeks still held the flush of attraction and confusion. My lips looked fuller somehow, as if Lucas's proximity had physically changed me, and my eyes held a brightness that spoke of awakening to possibilities I'd never considered. My phone buzzed with a text from my roommate Sarah, who was spending the night at her boyfriend's place. How was the mystery date? Did he turn out to be a serial killer? I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. How could I explain the evening I'd just experienced? The restaurant that had probably cost more than my monthly budget. The car that screamed wealth and power. The man who spoke to me as if I already belonged to him. How could I describe the way Lucas had looked at me? As if he was cataloging every expression for future reference. Or the casual authority with which he'd arranged our next meeting without actually asking for my consent. It was intense. I typed back, then deleted the words. They seemed inadequate to capture the strange mix of attraction and unease coursing through my veins. "Good intense or bad intense," came her immediate reply. I touched the pendant again, remembering the feel of Lucas's fingers against my neck, the way his breath had stirred the hair at my temple. "I'm not sure yet," I finally responded, and realized it was the most honest thing I'd said all evening. After changing into my pajamas, worn cotton that felt rough against skin that still remembered the whisper of expensive fabric, I sat on my narrow bed and examined the business card he'd given me. The address was in the Meridian district, where penthouses sold for more money than most people saw in a lifetime. No business name, no title, just a phone number, and that exclusive address printed on paper that probably cost more per sheet than I spent on groceries in a week. I turned the card over and found something that made my breath catch. My name written in elegant script across the back, as if he'd prepared it specifically for me before our date. The implications sent a chill through me. Had he known from the beginning that he intended to see me again? Had the entire evening been orchestrated with this moment in mind? My laptop sat open on my desk, and before I could think better of it, I was typing his name into a search engine. The results were surprisingly sparse. A few mentions in business journals related to import-export companies, a photograph from a charity gala where he stood slightly apart from the other attendees with the same hyper-vigilant posture I'd noticed at dinner. Nothing concrete. Nothing that explained the obvious wealth or the way people seemed to defer to him without question. But there was something in that charity gala photo that made me look closer. Standing just behind Lucas, and slightly to his right, was the same man who had approached our table during my bathroom break. The one with hard features who had melted away so smoothly, I'd wondered if I'd imagined him. In the photograph, his stance was unmistakably protective, his eyes scanning the crowd even as he remained partially hidden in Lucas's shadow. Bodyguard, I realized with a start. Lucas Moretti traveled with armed protection, which meant either he was paranoid to an extreme degree, or he moved in circles where such precautions were necessary. The thought should have terrified me, should have sent me reaching for my phone to cancel tomorrow night's plans. Instead, I found myself wondering what kind of life required such constant vigilance, what kind of power came with such obvious wealth. I closed the laptop and tried to focus on my evening routine, but everything felt different now. The pendant lay warm against my skin as I brushed my teeth, its weight a constant reminder of hands that had touched me with surprising gentleness. The business card sat on my nightstand like a promise or a threat, depending on how I chose to interpret it. When I finally turned off the lights and slipped under my covers, sleep remained elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw storm-gray irises studying me with predatory intensity, felt phantom fingers tracing my pulse point with possessive certainty. The way he'd said, "You're under my protection now," echoed in my mind, the phrasing growing more ominous with each repetition. Protection from what? And why did the offer feel less like security and more like a silk-wrapped chain? The last conscious thought I had before exhaustion finally claimed me was the realization that tomorrow evening couldn't come soon enough, despite every rational instinct screaming that I should run as far and as fast as possible from whatever Lucas Moretti represented. But reason seemed to have abandoned me somewhere between the first course and his fingers on my skin, leaving behind only curiosity and a dangerous attraction to the kind of man my mother had always warned me about. As I drifted toward sleep, my hand unconsciously moved to touch the pendant one more time, and I could have sworn I felt the phantom pressure of his fingers against my throat, marking me as surely as if he'd branded his name into my skin. The next day passed in a haze of distracted thoughts and phantom sensations. Every time I touched the pendant at my throat, which seemed to happen involuntarily every few minutes, I felt the ghost of Lucas's fingers against my skin. My literature professor's lecture on power dynamics in Victorian novels felt ironically appropriate, though I doubted she intended her students to apply the concepts to their own increasingly complicated love lives. Sarah cornered me between classes, her eyes immediately zeroing in on the necklace I'd tried unsuccessfully to hide beneath my sweater. "Holy shit, Lily," she breathed, reaching out to touch the pendant before I could stop her. "This is real, isn't it? Like, actual diamonds and gold real." "It's just a small gift," I said weakly, knowing how ridiculous the words sounded even as they left my mouth. "Small?" Sarah's voice pitched higher with disbelief. "This thing probably costs more than our rent for the entire semester. What exactly does this guy do for a living?" That was the question I'd been avoiding all day, the one that made my stomach clench with equal parts anticipation and dread. Import and export. I repeated Lucas's vague explanation, but Sarah's expression told me she wasn't buying it any more than I had. Lily, she said, her voice taking on the serious tone she usually reserved for discussions about our post-graduation plans. Be careful. Men don't drop this kind of money on strangers unless they want something specific in return. Her words echoed my own concerns, but they also triggered a defensive response I hadn't expected. Maybe he just wanted to do something nice, I said, though the explanation sounded hollow even to my own ears. Sarah raised an eyebrow, but didn't push further, though I caught her studying me with the same worried expression she'd worn when I'd dated that musician who'd turned out to have a cocaine habit. The comparison made me uncomfortable in ways I didn't want to examine too closely. By the time 8 o'clock approached, I'd changed clothes 3 times and applied makeup with a precision that bordered on obsessive. The face staring back at me from my mirror looked flushed and bright-eyed, vibrating with an energy I couldn't quite contain. The pendant caught the light as I moved, drawing attention to the hollow of my throat, where Lucas's breath had stirred against my skin. At exactly 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text. I'm outside. No greeting. No apology for not coming up to knock like a normal person might. Just the assumption that I would be ready and waiting for his arrival. The presumption should have annoyed me, but instead, I found myself grabbing my jacket and hurrying down the stairs with an eagerness that worried me. The same black Mercedes waited at the curb, but this time Lucas stood beside it instead of remaining hidden behind tinted windows. He wore dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that clung to his broad shoulders, somehow managing to look both more casual and more dangerous than he had in his suit. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his fingers through it, and when he smiled at my approach, I felt my knees go weak. Punctual, he observed with approval, opening the car door for me. I appreciate that quality in a woman. The phrasing struck me as oddly formal, but before I could analyze it further, I was settling into the leather seats and breathing in that intoxicating mix of his cologne and expensive materials. This time, Marco wasn't driving. Instead, Lucas slid behind the wheel himself, his movements fluid and controlled as he navigated the evening traffic. Where are we going? I asked, noting that we were heading away from the restaurant district and toward the residential areas where the city's elite maintained their homes. Somewhere more private, he replied, his eyes meeting mine briefly in the rearview mirror before returning to the road. I thought you might enjoy seeing where I live. The casual statement sent alarm bells ringing in my head. Going to a virtual stranger's home on the second date violated every safety rule I'd ever learned, every piece of advice my mother had drilled into me about dating. But when Lucas reached over to rest his hand on my thigh, his thumb tracing small circles through the fabric of my jeans, my protests died in my throat. Relax, cara mia, he said, seeming to sense my tension. I have no intention of doing anything you don't want me to do. The way he emphasized the word want sent heat pooling in my stomach, and I realized with mounting alarm that my body was already betraying my better judgment. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings about isolated locations and men who collected expensive things, but it was being steadily overwhelmed by the intoxicating presence of the man beside me. We drove through increasingly affluent neighborhoods, past manicured lawns and houses that looked more like museums than homes. Finally, Lucas turned through a set of imposing iron gates that opened automatically at our approach, revealing a driveway that curved through landscaped grounds toward a house that took my breath away. Calling it a house seemed insufficient. It was more like a modern palace. All clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that glowed with warm light against the darkening sky. The architecture managed to be both contemporary and timeless. Speaking of wealth so old and established, it didn't need to announce itself through ostentation. "This is your home?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "One of them," he replied casually, as if owning multiple properties worth millions was perfectly normal. "But this is my favorite," I think you'll understand why once you're inside. He came around to open my door, his hand settling at the small of my back as he guided me toward the entrance. The front door was a massive thing of dark wood and frosted glass that opened before we reached it, revealing a woman in her 50s, dressed in elegant black attire. "Good evening, Mr. Moretti," she said with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Shall I prepare dinner for two?" "Please, Elena. Something light. We ate well last night." His hand pressed more firmly against my back, steering me through a foyer that belonged in an art museum. "This is Lily, the young woman I mentioned." The fact that he'd mentioned me to his staff sent another flutter of unease through me. How much had he told them about me? And why did Elena's knowing smile make me feel like I was walking into a trap I couldn't see? The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior. Soaring ceilings, original artwork that I was fairly certain belonged in galleries, and furniture that managed to be both beautiful and comfortable. But it was the view that truly stole my breath away. The entire back wall of the main living area was glass, revealing grounds that stretched toward the city lights twinkling in the distance like fallen stars. "It's incredible," I said, moving toward the windows as if drawn by a magnet. "How do you ever leave?" "I don't, often," Lucas replied, moving to a well-stocked bar cart. "Wine? I have an excellent Chianti that I think you'll enjoy." Before I could respond, he was already pouring 2 glasses, his movements precise and practiced. Everything about his home spoke of money and taste, but also of something else. A fortress-like quality that suggested security was as important as aesthetics. I noticed the subtle cameras positioned throughout the room, the way certain windows were clearly reinforced, the fact that Elena moved through the space with the efficiency of someone accustomed to protocols and procedures. "Lucas," I said, accepting the wine glass he offered, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." But something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle tension that suggested wariness. "What exactly do you import and export?" His smile was enigmatic as he raised his glass in a toast. "Many things: art, wine, olive oil, specialty foods, beautiful objects that deserve to be appreciated by those who understand their value." The answer was as vague as his previous explanations, but delivered with such smooth confidence that I almost believed it. Almost. But the house around us suggested wealth far beyond what most legitimate import businesses could generate, and the security measures spoke of concerns that had nothing to do with protecting valuable art. "That's lucrative enough for all this?" I gestured toward the opulent surroundings. Lucas moved closer, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell that intoxicating cologne that seemed designed to scramble my thoughts. "When you know the right people and understand the true value of rare things," he said, his voice dropping to that intimate tone that made my pulse quicken. "Yes, it can be very lucrative indeed." Before I could ask what he meant by rare things, Elena appeared in the doorway. "Dinner is served, Mr. Moretti." The dining room continued the theme of understated elegance, dominated by a table that could have seated 12, but was set intimately for 2. Crystal glasses caught the light from a chandelier that probably cost more than my annual tuition, and the plates looked like they belonged in a museum collection. "This is too much," I said, feeling overwhelmed by the luxury surrounding me. "I'm just a college student, Lucas. I don't understand why you're doing all this." He pulled out my chair with the same old-world courtesy he'd displayed the night before, his hands lingering on my shoulders as I sat. "You underestimate yourself, Lily. You're not just anything." The way he said it, with such conviction, made something flutter in my chest despite my growing unease. Elena served course after course, each more exquisite than the last, while Lucas regaled me with stories that painted vivid pictures of his travels. He spoke of wine auctions in France, art galleries in Florence, business meetings in cities I'd only read about in books. But underneath the charming narrative, I began to notice things that didn't quite add up. The way he spoke about certain clients with a deference that suggested fear rather than respect. The casual mentions of security concerns that seemed excessive for someone in legitimate business. The fact that his phone buzzed constantly throughout dinner, each message causing a micro-expression of tension to flicker across his features before he composed himself again. "You're very popular tonight," I observed after the 5th interruption. "Business never sleeps," he replied smoothly, but I noticed he'd started keeping the phone face down on the table. "Forgive me. You deserve my full attention." When Elena cleared the last plates and disappeared into what I assumed was the kitchen, Lucas suggested we move to the terrace. The night air was cool against my skin as we stepped outside, but the view was worth any discomfort. The city spread below us like a circuit board of lights, beautiful and distant. "It's like being above the world," I said, accepting the fresh glass of wine he offered. "In many ways I am," he replied, and something in his tone made me look at him sharply. He was standing at the railing, his profile outlined against the city lights, and for a moment he looked like a king surveying his domain. "What do you mean by that?" He turned to face me fully, and in the moonlight, his expression was more serious than I'd ever seen it. "Lily," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made my stomach clench with sudden anxiety. "There are things about me you need to understand. Things I probably should have told you before bringing you here." My mouth went dry. "What kind of things?" Instead of answering immediately, he moved closer, his hands coming to rest on the railing on either side of me, effectively caging me against the stone balustrade. This close, I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, the way the moonlight caught the sharp angles of his cheekbones. "My business isn't entirely what I've led you to believe," he said, his voice low and intimate despite the gravity of his words. "Yes, I import and export goods, but some of those goods are, shall we say, not typically found in conventional marketplaces." The euphemism sent ice through my veins even as his proximity made my heart race. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm a man who operates outside certain legal boundaries when necessary. That the wealth you see around you comes from understanding markets that most people prefer to pretend don't exist." The confession should have sent me running for the nearest exit, should have triggered every self-preservation instinct I possessed. But trapped between his body and the railing, drowning in the intensity of his gaze, I found myself unable to move, unable to think beyond the immediate reality of his presence. "Are you trying to tell me you're a criminal?" I whispered. His smile was dark and predatory. "I'm telling you that I'm a man who takes what he wants and protects what belongs to him. That conventional morality is a luxury I can't afford." "And what does that have to do with me?" His hands moved from the railing to frame my face, his thumbs tracing my cheekbones with devastating gentleness. "Everything, cara mia, because from the moment I saw you, I knew you were meant to be mine. And I always claim what's mine." The possessive certainty in his voice should have terrified me. Instead, it sent a shock of heat straight through my core, making me suddenly aware of how close he was, how easy it would be to lean into his touch and let him take whatever he wanted. "Lucas," I began, not sure if I was going to protest or surrender. "Shh," he murmured, his thumb moving to trace my lower lip. "You feel it too, don't you? This connection between us, this inevitability." Before I could respond, his mouth was on mine, and rational thought fled entirely. His kiss was nothing like the tentative exploration I might have expected from a second date. It was claiming, possessive, designed to brand me as surely as if he'd marked me with a physical sigil. When he finally pulled away, I was breathless and trembling, my hands somehow having found their way to grip his sweater. "You belong to me now, Lily," he said against my lips, his voice carrying absolute conviction, "and I protect what's mine with everything I have." The declaration should have sent me running. Instead, I found myself drowning in storm-gray eyes, that promised both salvation and damnation. Wondering when the choice had been taken from me, and why I didn't seem to mind nearly as much as I should have. The morning after Lucas's revelation found me sitting in my constitutional law class, staring blankly at Professor Martinez as she discussed the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was learning about legal protections, while my thoughts remained consumed by a man who had essentially admitted to operating outside the law entirely. My fingers moved unconsciously to the pendant at my throat, the weight of it feeling heavier today, more significant. Every few minutes, my phone would buzz with a text from Lucas. Nothing demanding or intrusive, just gentle check-ins that somehow felt more possessive than outright commands. Thinking of you, read one. Hope your classes are going well, said another. Each message arrived with the precision of a man accustomed to maintaining contact with his assets. The thought should have disturbed me more than it did. Miss Chen? Professor Martinez's voice cut through my distraction. Perhaps you could enlighten us about the constitutional implications of consent in search and seizure cases. I blinked, realizing I'd been caught completely off guard. I'm sorry, Professor. Could you repeat the question? Her expression suggested this wasn't the first time I'd been inattentive today. I asked about consent. When does consent become meaningless from a constitutional perspective? The question felt loaded with personal significance. When it's given under duress? I said slowly, my voice growing stronger as the legal principles aligned with my swirling thoughts. When there's an imbalance of power that makes true consent impossible. When someone feels they have no real choice. Professor Martinez nodded approvingly, but I barely heard her follow-up explanation. The words I'd spoken echoed in my mind, raising questions I wasn't ready to confront about my own situation. Had my agreement to see Lucas again been freely given, or had it been the result of an intimidation so subtle I hadn't recognized it as such? After class, Sarah intercepted me in the hallway, her face creased with concern. Okay, spill, she demanded, falling into step beside me. You've been walking around like a zombie all day, and you keep touching that necklace like it's a rosary. What happened on date number 2? I opened my mouth to deflect with some casual lie, but the words that came out surprised me. I think I'm in over my head. Sarah stopped walking, grabbing my arm to halt my progress. What do you mean? Did he do something to you? Because if he hurt you, I swear I'll... No, I said quickly, though even as the denial left my lips, I wondered if it was entirely true. Lucas hadn't hurt me physically, but there was something about his presence, his certainty about my place in his life, that felt like a different kind of violation. It's complicated. Then uncomplicate it, Sarah said firmly. Start from the beginning. So I did. Sitting in a quiet corner of the campus coffee shop, I told her about the house that looked like something from a magazine. The staff who treated me like I was already part of the household. The way Lucas had confessed to criminal activities, as casually as he might have mentioned his favorite color. I told her about the kiss that had left me breathless and confused. About his declaration that I belonged to him now. What I didn't tell her was how that declaration had made me feel. Not just frightened, but oddly thrilled. How some dark part of me had responded to his possessive certainty with a hunger I didn't understand. Jesus, Lily, Sarah breathed when I finished. This guy is practically advertising that he's dangerous. You have to stop seeing him. I know, I said, but the words felt hollow. I know I should. Should? Sarah's voice pitched higher. There's no should about it. You call him right now and tell him you're done. Block his number. Change your schedule if you have to. This isn't a romance novel. This is real life, and real criminals don't turn into Prince Charming just because they buy you expensive jewelry. Her words stung because they echoed my own rational thoughts, the ones I'd been trying to ignore since Lucas's mouth had claimed mine on his terrace. But every logical argument was countered by the memory of his hands framing my face. the way he'd looked at me like I was something precious and rare. "You're right," I said, pulling out my phone. "I'll text him." But as I stared at the blank message screen, my fingers refused to type the words that would sever whatever strange connection had formed between us. Instead, I found myself scrolling through the messages he'd sent throughout the day, each one a small reminder that someone was thinking about me, caring about my day in ways no one ever had before. "Lily," Sarah said gently, "what are you not telling me?" I looked up to find her studying me with the same expression she'd worn when I'd admitted to having feelings for my obviously unavailable TA sophomore year. "I think I'm attracted to him," I whispered. "Not just physically, but to the danger. To the way he looks at me like I'm already his." Sarah's face went pale. "That's not attraction, Lily. That's trauma bonding. Stockholm Syndrome. Whatever you want to call it, it's not healthy." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Lucas's name appeared on the screen, and despite Sarah's horrified expression, I found myself answering. "Hello? Karamia?" His voice was warm honey through the speaker, and I felt my resolve crumble at the sound. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just studying," I said, ignoring Sarah's frantic gestures to hang up. "Good. I was wondering if you might be free this evening. There's something I'd like to show you." The reasonable part of my mind screamed warnings, but I heard myself saying, "What kind of something?" "A surprise. Trust me. You'll find it illuminating." Trust. The word hung between us, loaded with implications I was only beginning to understand. "Lucas? About last night." "We'll talk," he said smoothly. "I'll pick you up at 7. The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone while Sarah looked at me with undisguised horror. "Please tell me you didn't just agree to see him again," she said. "I didn't exactly agree," I protested weakly. "You didn't exactly refuse either." Sarah grabbed my hands, her grip tight enough to be uncomfortable. "Lily, listen to me. Whatever hold this guy has on you, you need to break it now, before it's too late." Her words followed me through the rest of the day, a constant litany of reasonable concerns that I found myself increasingly unable to heed. By the time 7 o'clock approached, I had changed clothes twice and applied makeup with the same obsessive precision I'd used the night before, all while telling myself I was going to end things with Lucas, definitively. The lies we tell ourselves are always the most convincing ones. This time, when I stepped outside my building, I found not just the Mercedes, but Lucas himself waiting for me. He leaned against the car with casual elegance, dressed in black jeans and a leather jacket that made him look like trouble personified. When he saw me approaching, his smile was slow and predatory, and I felt my carefully rehearsed rejection speech evaporate like morning mist. "You look beautiful," he said, pushing off from the car to greet me. His hand settled on my waist with possessive familiarity, and before I could protest, he was kissing me. Not the claiming kiss from his terrace, but something softer, more seductive. When he pulled back, I was breathless and off balance, my hands somehow having found their way to his chest. "Where are we going?" I managed to ask. "To see the other side of my world," he replied cryptically, opening the car door for me. "The side I think you need to understand if we're going to move forward together." The assumption that we were moving forward, that my participation was a given rather than a choice, should have triggered my flight response. Instead, I found myself settling into the familiar luxury of the car's interior, breathing in his scent and feeling my body relax despite my mind's protests. We drove through parts of the city I'd never seen before, industrial areas that transformed after dark into something altogether different. Neon signs advertised businesses that seemed to exist in legal gray areas, and the people on the streets moved with the kind of purposeful urgency that suggested danger lurked around every corner. "Welcome to the real city," Lucas said, noting my wide-eyed examination of our surroundings. "The one they don't show in tourism brochures." We pulled up outside a building that looked like it might have been a warehouse once upon a time. Now it pulsed with music and colored lights, and a line of expensively dressed people waited behind velvet ropes, while intimidating men in black suits decided who was worthy of entry. "This is yours?" I asked, taking in the obvious exclusivity of whatever was happening inside. "One of my investments," he confirmed, but the way the suited men straightened when they saw him suggested he was far more than a passive investor. "Come, I want you to see what I've built." The interior was nothing like I'd expected from the utilitarian exterior. The space had been transformed into something between a high-end nightclub and an exclusive casino. All dark wood and sultry lighting that made everything feel intimate and slightly dangerous. Beautiful people in expensive clothes clustered around gaming tables where chips worth more than my yearly expenses changed hands with casual indifference. But it was the way people reacted to Lucas's presence that truly opened my eyes to his position in this world. Conversations paused as we walked by, heads inclining in subtle acknowledgement of his status. Staff members materialized to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. Even the patrons, who clearly had money and power of their own, treated him with a deference that spoke of fear wrapped in respect. Mr. Moretti, a woman in an elegant black dress, appeared at his elbow. "Your usual table is ready." We were led to a raised section overlooking the main floor, separated from the general population by both elevation and subtle psychological barriers. From here, Lucas could observe everything while remaining slightly apart, like a king holding court from his throne. "Impressive," I said, accepting the glass of champagne that appeared without being ordered. "This is nothing," Lucas replied, his hand settling possessively on my thigh. "This is just the legitimate face I show the world. The real business happens elsewhere." As if to illustrate his point, a man approached our table. Someone whose expensive suit couldn't quite disguise the hardness in his features, or the way his eyes constantly scanned for threats. He leaned down to whisper something in Lucas's ear, speaking too quietly for me to hear over the ambient music and conversation. Lucas nodded once, his expression growing cold and calculating. "Handle it," he said simply, and the man melted away as quickly as he'd appeared. "Problems?" I asked, noting the subtle tension that had entered Lucas's posture. "Nothing I can't resolve," he replied, but his free hand moved to rest on the table where I could see the expensive watch that probably contained more technology than it appeared to. Business occasionally requires direct intervention. The euphemism sent a chill through me, even as his thumb traced circles on my thigh, the gentle touch at odds with the underlying threat in his words. This was what Sarah had tried to warn me about, the seductive danger of a man who could kill with the same casual efficiency he used to order wine. "Lucas," I began, finally ready to voice the concerns that had been building all day. "Shh," he murmured, his lips close to my ear. "Watch and learn, cara mia. This is the world you're entering, the world where I can give you everything you've ever wanted and protect you from anything that might threaten to take it away." Before I could respond, he was standing, his hand extended to help me up. "Come. There's someone I want you to meet." He led me through the crowd toward a private elevator I hadn't noticed before, one that required a key card to operate. As we rose toward what I assumed were offices or private rooms, I felt the weight of his hand on the small of my back, guiding me deeper into his world with each floor we climbed. The elevator opened into a hallway that was quieter, more serious than the controlled chaos below. Here, the pretense of entertainment fell away, replaced by the efficient atmosphere of serious business being conducted. Lucas guided me toward a door marked "Private," his movements confident and sure. "Are you ready to see who I really am?" he asked, his hand on the door handle. Before I could answer, Before I could voice the dozen concerns crowding my throat, he was opening the door and ushering me into a room that would change everything I thought I understood about the man I was falling for. The office beyond was elegant, but unmistakably functional, dominated by a massive desk and walls lined with monitors showing security feeds from throughout the building. But it was the conversation taking place at the conference table that made my breath catch in my throat. Men in expensive suits discussing numbers that made my head spin, talking about shipments and territories and enforcement with the casual efficiency of a board meeting. This wasn't just criminal activity. This was organized crime on a scale I'd never imagined, with Lucas at the center of it all like a spider in an intricate web of power and violence. "Gentlemen," Lucas announced our presence, and every head turned toward us with expressions that ranged from surprise to calculating. "I'd like you to meet someone very important to me." The way he said it, with such possessive pride, made it clear that my presence here was more than casual introduction. I was being presented to his associates, marked as his in front of the men who helped him run his empire. And despite every rational thought screaming that I should run, should escape while I still could, I found myself stepping closer to Lucas's side, accepting the protection of his presence, even as I finally understood the true cost of his devotion. The meeting in Lucas's office lasted exactly 47 minutes. I found myself counting each one, hyper-aware of every glance, every subtle nod of acknowledgement directed my way. The men around the conference table spoke in a mixture of English and Italian, their conversation peppered with terms I didn't understand, but somehow knew I shouldn't. Territory disputes, payment schedules, enforcement protocols, the language of organized crime delivered with the same professional courtesy I'd expect from a corporate boardroom. What struck me most wasn't the criminal nature of their business, but how naturally Lucas commanded the room. These weren't men accustomed to taking orders, yet they deferred to his judgment without question. When he spoke, they listened. When he made decisions, they accepted them as final. This was his empire, and I was watching him rule it with the casual authority of someone born to power. "The Rossetti situation requires delicate handling," one of the men was saying, his accent thick with something Eastern European. "They've been testing boundaries in the harbor district." Lucas's expression remained impassive, but I felt the subtle tension that entered his frame where he stood behind my chair, his hand resting possessively on my shoulder. "Testing boundaries is one thing, Victor. Open disrespect is another entirely." The way he said it sent ice through my veins. So casual, so matter-of-fact, as if discussing someone's potential death was just another item on his business agenda. But his thumb traced gentle circles on my shoulder, the tender gesture at odds with the implied violence in his words. "What would you like us to do?" Victor asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Send a message," Lucas replied simply. "Something clear, but not permanent, yet." The qualifier hung in the air like a promise and a threat combined. I found myself gripping the arms of my chair to keep my hands from trembling, overwhelmed by the casual way these men discussed violence as a business tool. But Lucas's touch remained steady and warm, a constant reminder of his protection, even as I witnessed the darker aspects of how that protection was maintained. When the meeting finally concluded, and the other men filed out with respectful nods in our direction, I remained frozen in my chair, staring at the monitors showing security feeds from every corner of Lucas's domain. On one screen, I could see couples dancing on the main floor below. On another, serious-faced men in expensive suits conducted quiet conversations over glasses of aged whiskey. It all looked so civilized, so normal. Nothing to suggest the life-and-death decisions being made in the room where I sat. "Overwhelming?" Lucas asked gently, moving around to perch on the edge of his desk in front of me. "Terrifying," I admitted, meeting his storm-gray eyes despite the tremor in my voice. "Those men respect you because they're afraid of you." His smile was enigmatic. "Fear and respect often go hand in hand in my world, cara mia. But what matters is that they understand the consequences of crossing me or threatening what belongs to me. There it was again. That casual possessiveness that should have sent me running, but instead made something dark and hungry unfurl in my chest. And I belong to you now? You have since the moment you agreed to dinner, he said with such certainty that it stole my breath. The only question is whether you're ready to accept what that means. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, and something cold and dangerous flickered across his features. "Excuse me," he said, answering with a curt, "Moretti." I couldn't understand the rapid Italian that followed, but I didn't need translation to recognize anger when I heard it. Lucas's voice remained controlled, but his free hand clenched into a fist on the desk beside him, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Handle it," he said finally, ending the call with more force than necessary. When he looked at me again, his expression had shifted from possessive gentleman to something far more dangerous. "Problem?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Someone has made a serious error in judgment," he replied, his voice carrying undertones that made my skin prickle with unease. "They've forgotten that certain territories are protected, that certain people are off limits." The way he said certain people while looking directly at me sent a jolt of fear through my system. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, he moved to his desk and pulled out what looked like a surveillance photograph. He set it in front of me with careful precision, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The image showed me leaving my apartment building that morning, but I wasn't alone. A man I didn't recognize stood in the background, his attention clearly focused on me, despite his casual attempt to blend into the crowd. "You've been watched," Lucas said, his voice deadly calm despite the fury burning in his eyes. "Followed, photographed, by men who work for people who would like very much to use you against me." My hands shook as I stared at the photograph, realizing that my ordinary Tuesday morning walk to campus had been anything but ordinary. Someone had been stalking me, documenting my movements, and I'd been completely oblivious to the danger. "Who?" I whispered. "Competitors who believe they can leverage my attachment to you." His jaw clenched with visible effort to maintain control. They're about to learn how catastrophically wrong they are. The possessive fury in his voice should have terrified me. Instead, I found myself leaning closer to him, drawn to the promise of protection, even as I understood its violent implications. "What are you going to do?" "What I always do when someone threatens what's mine," he replied, moving around the desk to crouch in front of my chair. His hands framed my face with devastating gentleness, the touch tender despite the violence simmering beneath his surface. "I eliminate the threat." The matter-of-fact way he spoke about ending lives made my stomach clench with fear, and something else I didn't want to examine too closely. "Lucas, I can't be responsible for people getting hurt because of me." "You're not responsible," he said firmly, his thumbs tracing my cheekbones with exquisite care. "I am. This is what it means to be mine, Lily. You're protected absolutely, regardless of the cost to those who would harm you." Before I could respond, he was standing and moving toward a safe I hadn't noticed before, hidden behind what had appeared to be a bookshelf. When he returned, he carried a small velvet box that he placed on the desk between us. "Open it," he said. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid, revealing a key unlike anything I'd ever seen. Heavy silver inlaid with what looked like genuine sapphires, far too ornate to be functional. But when Lucas lifted it from its velvet nest, I could see it was very real indeed. "This opens a safe house I maintain for emergencies," he explained, pressing the key into my palm. "The address is engraved on the back. If anything ever happens, if you're ever in danger and can't reach me, you go there. The staff know to expect you and will protect you until I can arrive." The weight of the key in my hand felt like a chain, beautiful and precious, and utterly binding. Why are you giving me this? Because you're mine now, he said simply, as if that explained everything. And I protect what belongs to me with everything I have. The declaration should have triggered every independent instinct I possessed, should have sent me running for the nearest exit. Instead, I found myself studying the intricate patterns carved into the key, overwhelmed by the implications of accepting it. This wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was an invitation into his world, a world where beautiful women were protected by men who killed without hesitation. I need time to think, I said weakly, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew my decision had already been made somewhere between his first touch and the photograph of my stalker. Of course, Lucas agreed, but his smile suggested he could see the surrender in my eyes despite my protests. But while you're thinking, you'll be staying somewhere safe. Elena has prepared a room for you at my house. The casual assumption that I would abandon my apartment, my independence, my entire life to hide in his fortress made my pulse quicken with alarm. I can't just disappear, Lucas. I have classes, friends, responsibilities. Which will all be handled, he interrupted gently. Your professors will be informed that you're dealing with a family emergency. Your roommate will be told you're staying with a friend for a while. Everything will be arranged so that your absence raises no suspicions. The efficiency with which he'd already orchestrated my disappearance from my normal life was breathtaking in its completeness. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by the evening's revelation. This had been planned, prepared for, as if my eventual capitulation had been inevitable from the beginning. And if I refuse? I asked, though we both knew the question was purely theoretical at this point. His expression grew deadly serious. Then you'll be in danger, and I'll be forced to take more. Permanent steps to ensure your safety. Steps that will eliminate any choice in the matter. The threat was delivered with such gentle certainty that it took a moment for its implications to sink in. He wasn't just offering me protection. He was informing me that my independence was no longer an option. I could accept his care willingly, or he would impose it by force. That's not really a choice, I said. No, he agreed with devastating honesty. It's not. But then, choice became irrelevant the moment someone decided to use you against me. He moved closer, his hands settling on the arms of my chair, caging me in with his presence. This close, I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, the way his jaw clenched with the effort of maintaining control over whatever violent impulses the evening had triggered. I know this is overwhelming, he said, his voice softening to that intimate tone that made my resistance crumble. I know it's not how you imagined your life unfolding, but I can give you everything, Lily. Safety, luxury, protection from a world that would destroy you without a second thought. All I ask in return is that you trust me to know what's best for you. The offer was seductive in its completeness, not just material comfort, but absolute security in exchange for absolute surrender. All I had to do was stop fighting the inevitable and let him take control of my life entirely. And if I want to leave someday, I whispered. His smile was dark and possessive. You won't. The certainty in his voice should have terrified me. Instead, it sent heat pooling in my stomach, made me acutely aware of how close he was, how easy it would be to stop fighting and let him claim me completely. Lucas, I began, not sure if I was going to surrender or make one last attempt at resistance. Before I could decide, his mouth was on mine, and rational thought fled entirely. This kiss was different from the others, hungrier, more possessive, designed to brand me as surely as if he'd pressed a hot iron to my skin. When he finally pulled away, I was breathless and clinging to his shoulders, my carefully constructed walls in complete ruins. Say yes, he murmured against my lips. Say you're mine, and let me take care of everything. The word hovered on my tongue, heavy with implications I was only beginning to understand. Saying yes meant abandoning my old life entirely, meant accepting a future where my safety came at the cost of other people's lives, where my comfort was built on a foundation of violence and fear. But it also meant never again worrying about rent or bills, or whether I was safe walking alone at night. It meant being cherished and protected by a man who commanded an empire with the same careful attention he paid to my pleasure. It meant accepting that I was precious enough to kill for. "Yes," I whispered, and felt the last of my resistance crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. His smile was triumphant and tender and terrifying all at once. "Perfect," he murmured, sealing my surrender with another kiss that tasted like expensive wine and inevitable surrender. "Welcome to your new life, cara mia. I promise you'll never regret choosing me." As he led me from the office toward whatever future he'd planned for us, I wondered if regret was even possible when choice had been nothing more than a beautiful illusion all along. 3 weeks later, I stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of Lucas's penthouse, watching the city spread below me like a glittering circuit board. The view never lost its power to mesmerize, but lately, it felt more like looking at a world I'd once belonged to, rather than one I might return to someday. My old life, the cramped apartment, the part-time job at the campus bookstore, the constant worry about money, seemed like memories from someone else's existence. Elena appeared beside me with a cup of coffee prepared exactly how I'd learned to like it during my stay. Rich, dark, with just a hint of cream and sugar. Everything in Lucas's world was customized to perfection, including me. "Mr. Moretti will be back this evening," she said in her carefully modulated voice. "He asked me to inform you that dinner will be at 8, and he has a surprise for you." I nodded, accepting the coffee while my stomach performed its familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with anxiety. Lucas had been away for 3 days handling what he euphemistically called business complications, something to do with the territorial dispute he'd mentioned in that boardroom meeting that felt like a lifetime ago. I'd learned not to ask for details about his work, understanding instinctively that some knowledge came with prices I wasn't ready to pay. "Thank you, Elena," I said, noting how the older woman's eyes lingered on me with something that might have been sympathy. She'd been nothing but kind during my transition into this strange, new existence, but sometimes I caught her watching me with the same expression someone might wear while observing a beautiful bird in a very elegant cage. The afternoon passed slowly, as they all did when Lucas was away. I'd read 3 books from his extensive library, learned to use the gym equipment he'd had installed specifically for me, and even attempted to paint in the art studio he'd created in one of the spare bedrooms. But nothing quite filled the restless energy that seemed to plague me whenever I was left alone with my thoughts for too long. The truth was, I missed my old life more than I'd expected. Not the financial stress or the uncertainty, but the simple freedom to walk outside whenever I wanted, to make plans without consulting security protocols, to exist without the constant awareness that my every movement was monitored and protected by armed men. Even trips to purchase personal items required advance notice and coordination with Lucas's security team. The golden cage was beautiful, but it was still a cage. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, the 3rd one this week. "Still worried about you. Call me when you can." I'd been instructed to maintain minimal contact with my old life to avoid complications, but Lucas had grudgingly agreed that cutting off all communication would raise more suspicions than carefully managed correspondence. So I sent brief, cheerful messages about my family emergency and staying with relatives, while avoiding any specifics that might lead to awkward questions. As evening approached, I found myself taking unusual care with my appearance. The walk-in closet Lucas had stocked for me contained more beautiful clothes than I'd owned in my entire life. Designer pieces in fabric so luxurious they felt like silk against my skin. Tonight, I chose a deep emerald dress that hugged my curves without being overtly sexual, paired with the diamond earrings he'd given me the previous week, just because. Each gift had been a small claiming, I'd come to realize. The necklace from our first date, the earrings, the key to his safe house that now lived in a place of honor on my nightstand. Each beautiful offering had been another link in the chain binding me to his world, and I'd accepted them all with increasing eagerness. At exactly 8 o'clock, I heard the elevator's soft chime announcing Lucas's return. My pulse quickened involuntarily, and I found myself smoothing my hair one final time before moving to greet him. The past 3 weeks had taught me that Lucas valued punctuality and preparation, small ways I could show my adaptation to his expectations. He emerged from the elevator looking devastating in a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. But there was something different about his expression tonight. The usual controlled composure was still there, but underneath it lurked a satisfaction that seemed almost predatory in its intensity. "Cara mia," he said, crossing the space between us with fluid grace. His hand settled on my waist as he pulled me close for a kiss that tasted of possession and promises. "You look exquisite." "How was your trip?" I asked, though I knew better than to expect detailed answers. "Productive," he replied, his smile sharp and dangerous. "Very productive. The Rossetti situation has been resolved." The way he said resolved sent a familiar chill through me. I'd learned to recognize the subtle shifts in his tone that indicated when his business had turned violent, and tonight's satisfaction suggested that someone had paid a permanent price for crossing him. "Good," I heard myself say, and realized with a start that I meant it. 3 weeks ago, the thought of Lucas ordering someone's death would have horrified me. Now it merely confirmed what I'd always known, that he was a man who protected what belonged to him with absolute ruthlessness. His eyes lit with approval at my response. "You're adapting beautifully," he murmured, his thumb tracing my cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "Better than I'd hoped." Before I could respond, Elena appeared to announce that dinner was ready, but instead of leading me toward the dining room, Lucas took my hand and guided me toward the elevator. "Where are we going?" I asked as we descended past the penthouse level. "To see your surprise?" he replied, his grip on my hand tightening possessively. "Something I've been preparing since the day you agreed to be mine." The elevator stopped at a level I'd never visited before, one that required Lucas's keycard to access. When the doors opened, I found myself looking at what appeared to be a private office complex. Multiple rooms connected by an elegantly appointed hallway that spoke of serious business conducted away from prying eyes. Lucas led me to a door marked with my name in elegant script, and my breath caught in my throat. Inside was an office that belonged in a magazine spread, mahogany desk, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a view of the city that rivaled his penthouse. But it was the nameplate on the desk that made my knees weak. Lily Chen, Director of Cultural Acquisitions. "What is this?" I whispered, running my fingers along the smooth surface of the desk. "Your new position," Lucas replied, moving to stand behind me, his hands settling possessively on my shoulders. "I've decided it's time you became more formally involved in my legitimate business interests. The job was clearly created specifically for me, a way to give me purpose within his organization, while keeping me firmly under his control." But as I looked around the beautiful office, imagined the work I might do here, I felt something dangerous unfurl in my chest. Not just gratitude, but genuine excitement. "Cultural acquisitions?" I asked. "Art, rare books, historical artifacts," he explained, his breath warm against my ear. "Things that require someone with your education and aesthetic sensibilities. Someone I can trust absolutely to represent my interests." The position would make me complicit in his empire in ways I'd managed to avoid during my 3 weeks of comfortable captivity. But it would also give me agency within his world, a role that mattered beyond simply being his beautiful possession. "What would be expected of me?" I asked, though I could hear the surrender in my own voice. "Attend auctions, evaluate acquisitions, travel to galleries and private collections when necessary," he said, his hands tightening slightly on my shoulders. Always with appropriate security, of course. And always with the understanding that you represent not just my business interests, but my personal ones as well. The implication was clear. I would be his ambassador to the legitimate art world, marked as his in ways that would make my position in his life unmistakably clear to anyone who mattered. It was a role that would cement my place in his organization, while making it increasingly difficult to imagine any alternative future. "Lucas," I began, not sure what I wanted to say. "There's more," he interrupted gently, turning me to face him. His expression was serious, almost vulnerable in a way I'd rarely seen. "This office is just the beginning. I want to give you everything, Lily. Not just comfort and security, but purpose. A reason to wake up every morning grateful to be exactly where you are." His hands moved to frame my face, thumbs tracing my cheekbones with exquisite tenderness. "I want you to be happy here. Genuinely happy. Not just resigned to your circumstances." The confession caught me off guard with its honesty. Despite his absolute control over every aspect of my existence, he genuinely cared about my contentment in ways that went beyond simple possession. He wanted me to choose him, not just because I had no alternatives, but because I couldn't imagine wanting any. "What if I said I wanted to finish school?" I asked, testing the boundaries of his generosity. "Then I would arrange for private tutors to complete your degree," he replied without hesitation. "Whatever you need to feel fulfilled, cara mia, as long as you understand that your life is here, with me, permanently." The qualifier hung between us like a silk rope, beautiful but utterly binding. He would give me anything I wanted except the one thing I couldn't ask for: freedom. "And if someday I changed my mind," I whispered, "if I decided I wanted something different?" His expression grew cold, predatory in a way that reminded me exactly who I was dealing with. "That won't happen," he said with deadly certainty, "because I'll make sure you never want for anything, because I'll love you so completely that the thought of leaving becomes not just impossible, but unthinkable." The promise was both romantic and terrifying, delivered with the absolute conviction of a man who had never failed to obtain what he wanted. He would make me happy, make me grateful, make me so thoroughly his that I would stop fighting not because I had to, but because I no longer wanted to. "I love you," he said suddenly, the words dropping between us like stones into still water. "I've loved you since that first night at dinner, when you tried so hard to be brave despite your obvious fear. I love your intelligence, your beauty, your strength, and I will spend every day for the rest of our lives making sure you understand how precious you are to me." The declaration should have filled me with joy. Instead, it left me breathless with the weight of its implications. This wasn't just love. It was obsession, possession, a need so intense it had reshaped both our lives around its satisfaction. "Lucas," I breathed, not sure if I was going to confess my own feelings or make one last attempt at resistance. "Say it," he commanded softly, his voice carrying undertones that made my pulse quicken. "Say you love me too." The words hovered on my tongue, heavy with finality. Saying them would be the last step in my transformation from independent college student to willing participant in his dangerous world. Once spoken, there would be no pretending this was temporary, no comforting myself with fantasies of eventual escape. But as I looked into his storm-gray eyes, saw the vulnerability beneath his commanding exterior, I realized the words had been true for weeks. I had fallen in love with my beautiful captor, had found in his possessive devotion something I'd never known I needed. "I love you," I whispered, and felt the last chain lock into place around my heart. His smile was triumphant and tender, and devastating all at once. "Perfect," he murmured, sealing my surrender with a kiss that tasted like expensive wine and inevitable destiny. "Welcome to forever, cara mia." As his mouth claimed mine with possessive certainty, I realized that freedom had been an illusion all along. True security, real love, the kind of protection that turned other people into obstacles to be removed. These things came with prices that couldn't be measured in conventional terms. But as Lucas's hands tangled in my hair and his body pressed against mine with commanding heat, I found I was more than willing to pay whatever the cost might be. My old life, my independence, my illusions of choice. They were small sacrifices compared to the empire of devotion he offered in return. When he finally pulled back, his eyes held promises that made my breath catch in my throat. "Now," he said, his voice rough with desire and satisfaction, "let me show you just how thoroughly you belong to me." As he led me toward the elevator, and whatever future he'd planned for us, I realized that surrender had never felt so much like victory. I was his now, completely and irrevocably, and the most terrifying part was how right it felt to let him claim every piece of my soul. The golden cage had become a kingdom, and I was no longer its prisoner. I was its willing queen.